Govert Schuller is a Dutch-American author who studies and writes about an Indian philosopher, Krishnamurti, and philosophy in general, and theosophy in particular. He first studied philosophy in the Netherlands, his homeland, and later at Northern Illinois University under the Heidegger scholar Theodor Kissel, who, in parentheses, I would say, whose daughter I happen to know, as she was a student in an undergraduate urban studies program that I worked for in the 1980s in Chicago. Hovert's master's degree was on narrative identity theory, and he is now a research scholar at Northern Hills University in Shillong, India. For 23 years, he has maintained a website looking at spirituality, philosophy, and politics from a critical, skeptical, and evolutionary point of view. It's called altheist.org, and you'll find it there. Govert became interested in monetary reform after meeting Stephen Zarlenga in 2008. After attending the 2014 AMI conference, where many of us met him, he participated in many of AMI's activities promoting monetary reform. Govert is a founding member of the Alliance for Just Money, and he was one of the editors of its 2020 publication that was a compilation of monetary reform articles in Spanish. And I won't butcher the pronunciation of it all, but I will post the link after I speak. In 2021, he acted as AFJM's first managing director for 6 months, and that was really a silver lining for AFJM of the COVID pandemic, because Govert was working at a high-end restaurant that he was furloughed from, and we were able to get his time for a small amount of money that was all he could earn as the difference of what he was getting through the furlough. But he taught AMI how to have staff, and we've had staff, not AMI. He taught AFJM how to have staff, and we are indebted to him for that. And he helped to train our first 2 part-time staff, co-managing directors. And so that is a blessing that he's given to us. And without further ado, he is, I think I had somewhere here what he's speaking on, but I can't find it in my notes. So I will let you introduce your talk here today, Govert. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being here. And thank you for your incredible contributions to AMI and to Stephen Walsh's health over the last few years in helping us transition to this online mode. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, keeping Stephen alive, that's that's a good thing, of course. Okay. Thank you so much, Lucille. Good memories of all this working together at AFGM, of course. Good memories of working with Stephen at AMI. But yeah, now I'm in India doing some more studies, and I will not talk more, but just start sharing the screens because I got some. Okay. You took away my screen sharing.
Are you co-host?
Yeah,
No.
Okay, I'm back again. That's good. I got it. Okay. I guess this is visible.
Yes.
Okay.
People need to, the best viewing seems to be fit to window in your view options at the top if you don't have that set.
Yeah, because I invite you basically to read along. I have also in the second part more visual items like tables and maps. But in the beginning, it will be basically part of a paper for you to read along. It will be about 1 hour, so I might give it a little bit more pace, so we got a little more time for question and answer. So without further ado, the title is The Future of Civilization and Money, but it will have a funny start. So this is an attempt to correlate a few research programs from disparate disciplines to see if a coherent narrative could be developed to meaningfully integrate apparently diverse but possibly intimately entwined historical developments during the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, in the realms of A, psychological mentalities, B, socioeconomic practices, and C, political historical organization. This then will provide the deep background to better jump into the future. And I have to figure out how to get to the next one. Hold on, guys. This is going too far. I just have to be... Okay. The IDs I have in mind, and I'll name the scholar, his field and major IDs are: 1, Julian Jaynes, a psychologist with several hypotheses about consciousness or mental architectures. Let's say their sequential variance, the logic of its changes, and its dating over a timeline of about 12,000 BC till modern times. So that's about 14,000 years. He perceives a profound change in consciousness happening because of social crises caused by disasters between 2000 and 1000 before the Common Era. Second one I'm bringing in is David Wilkinson, a historian working in the rise, fall, and amalgamation of civilizations or world systems, who also proposes a timeline from about 3000 BCE till modern times with a focus on the emergence of a central civilization, in the merging of the Egyptian with the Mesopotamian civilization into one entity around 1500 BCE. Third one, and that's a friend of ours in our movement, Michael Hudson. He's an economist with a specialization in finance and economic history, and also covers in his research this period from about 3000 BCE or even earlier till modern times, but with a specialization in the ancient civilizations of the Middle East. Now, what Jaynes and Wilkinson, the first two I mentioned, have in common is the sense that around 1500 BC, something world historical occurred. Jaynes perceives a profound change of mental architecture, and Wilkinson sees the start of a central civilization, which is now in its global phase and is dominating almost the entire world. Hudson also makes the case that socioeconomic practices before and after the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, were identifiably different to the extent that academia still has not come to terms with it. And my observation is also that this academic shortcoming could also apply to the understanding and acceptance of Jaynesian psychology and Wilkinson's concept of central civilization. I will present the major ideas of all three scholars with the hope that it will be obvious how they cohere in a layered ontology of A, a changing mind, engaged in B, changing socioeconomic practices, in C, the context of a changing world system. So I'll start with Julian Jaynes and the so-called contingent structures of consciousness. What Jaynes focuses on is the rise of modern consciousness in the sense of people acquiring the capacity to self-consciously think for and about themselves, even constituting a quote-unquote self in the process. This kind of imaginative thinking is executed in a metaphoric inner mind space, in which people can run alternate scenarios for decision-making, or in non-routine situations, using the imagination in which an I could project its me into a plausible future, or rerun experiences from its past. Jaynes thinks that's one of the key aspects of our so-called modern consciousness. So this is what could be called present-day human mind, PHM. Among its advantages for both individuals and groups is the capacity to develop, execute, and track non-routine plans aimed at better outcomes than the habitual following of mere routines would accomplish. At the same time, in the context of individuals and groups competing for resources, this capacity would bring to a more conscious level ego and group-centric practices of deliberate secrecy and deceit, something James claims bicameral man was not capable of. So bicameral man, we'll get to that more. That's the mind architecture preceding the modern mind. This does not deny that people were not capable of deceit and self-deception before the present-day human mind came online. But such deceptions were executed in an instinctual, habitual manner and not deliberative or conscious in the Jamesian sense. The predecessor of this mental architecture was then the bicameral mind, a collective form of obedience by not yet individuated persons to predominantly kings and priests, who in their turn obeyed their gods and ancestors. And this is the key point, experienced through audible command hallucinations. So we're talking about people having audible command hallucinations, hearing their ancestors, hearing angels, hearing gods, and usually they would tell them what to do under non-routine situations, crises, especially crises. This setup was functional in the palace system, which had evolved in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, until it was unable to handle the polycrises of especially the 12th century BCE, when most of these mini-civilizations broke down because the voices of the gods could not anymore disseminate adaptive instructions to its leaders and populations. It's a very dramatic breakdown of a psychological architecture based on the gods giving instructions. The precise dating of the rise of pockets of more crisis-resilient individualized consciousness is hard to determine, as well as the time when it became predominant and replaced the direct experience of commanding voices. Two disasters in the second millennium BCE would have put bicameral societies under great stress. The first was the Minoan eruption of Terra, Santorini, in the Mediterranean in the 16th century. And the second, more dramatic, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC or BCE. Following Toynbee's logic of challenge and response by creative minorities, it could be argued that in the ensuing clash of communities, small groups of bicamerally lost people stumbled upon and developed modern self-aware, introspective consciousness, in which the hallucinated voices were tamed and became what we now interpret as internal thoughts. Because of its advantages for group cohesion, this mentality would spread throughout the larger populations following the three-step evolutionary logic of 1, random origination, 2, reproducibility, and 3, selection for fitness. This is applying to cultural evolution, of course, not genetic evolution. James argues that in the case of ancient Greece, the mentality of the characters in the Iliad were still bicameral, and that of the Odyssey was modern. So although both books are ascribed to Homer, it's a whole group of people that wrote the books, and probably with different groups involved in the Iliad, different groups in the Odyssey. The Iliad, a lot of the heroes were obeying their hallucinations. In the Odyssey, it's more that the people have this sense of individuality to figure out things for themselves. Also for James, the rise of religious practices like divination, mediums, oracles, etc., were indications that the hallucinated gods had retreated, and other means of communication to solicit instructions from the beyond had to be found. Then only in classic Greece, a skepticism set in about the gods, and a rational mentality took off, enabling a sense of rational agency, which encompassed individualistic independence and deliberative choice. And even larger geographic and temporal horizons beyond daily concerns were developed or found, including ever more idealized abstract notions of the categories of space, time, and causality. Even so, divinatory practices endured for many centuries and are still with us. And here in this last paragraph, I'm referring to the rise of skepticism and philosophy. Okay, David Wilkinson and the civilizational world system of central civilization. For Wilkinson, the world historical event was the melding of the Egyptian with Mesopotamian civilization into one entity, which he named central civilization. This fusion happened around 1500 BC, and in his own words, quote, central civilization, the single global civilization, and he talks about now, the single global civilization is the lineal descendant of, or rather I should say, the current manifestation of a civilization that emerged about 1500 BC in the Near East, when Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations collided and fused. This new fusional entity has since then expanded over the entire planet and absorbed on unequal terms all other previously independent civilizations. If you look at the figure in figure 2, and we'll get to that, you will see an alternative conceptualization of the march of civilizations. This one is based on the merging of, on one side, historical investigations of comparing civilizations. Here, the big names are, it started actually with Spengler, a German, Arnold Tolby is a big guy in it, and Carol Quigley also. And that's on one side, that's on the historical side. On the sociological side, sociological investigations in the field of world system theory. And the big names here are Immanuel Wallerstein and André Gunder Frank. Or as Wilkinson exclaimed, civilizations are world systems. And that's kind of the very short of the coming together of these two research programs. So there are two ways to depict the fusion of these two programs. One is a deontology of the research, and the second, a spatial representation of the systems. So here, and later I will upload this whole document so you can look for yourself, is what kind of really interesting research happened between 1900 and 2000. I have organized it in a timeline from bottom to top, and then certain categories, 4 of them from left to right. So there's a whole program of power elite studies. Mostly they will look for C. Wright Mills and his book, The Power Elite from 1956, that initiated this research. Domhoff, G. William Domhoff, was his student, and he came with the book Who Rules America, which is still in print and now in an 8th edition. People like Lawrence Shoup and Minter are part of it, Holy Sklar. It's a whole line of deepening of the sense of how does the power elite run first America, run the Atlantic Coalition, or just runs the whole world. The second one is more a miscellaneous input. Polanyi, the great Polanyi of the Great Transformation. And above him, of course, is Marx. He is influential in any of these investigations. Then we have the 2 last columns, world systems theory and comparative civilizations. And that's the 2 that are melding in their research. So there's Paul Moran, Marxist or neo-Marxist in the United States. There is Brodel, just under him, Civilization and Capitalism. Very influential, very deep and interesting. And then Immanuel Wallerstein picking this up in the mid-70s in the concept of the modern world system. Then the other line, comparative civilizations, I talked, Spengler is a starter of that way of comparing civilizations, because then historical research has done enough research that you could have this sense of these different civilizations. Toynbee, absolutely crucial with his sense. A study of history was then also a 12-volume study that came out over a time of almost 30 years. Carol Quigley with his evolution of civilization part of it, McNeil, etc., etc. And then there is this Wilkinson, 1987, Central Civilization. Wilkinson makes this claim, and we'll see his figure of this fusion of Mesopotamia with Egypt and what else happened. If you're really interested in that, the book or the anthology to have is then Sanderson, 1996, Civilizations and World Systems. So what both research programs seem to agree on is that the origin of the now globalized Western civilization is merely a phase of what they now call Central Civilization. That is, the merger of Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations around 1500 BC. This entity then went through a Near Eastern phase, then a Greco-Roman phase, then a medieval one, then Western, and now a global phase. And in its growth, it gobbled up almost any and all other civilizations and indigenous people. And this is the best I've been able to do, to have a copy of a copy and then made a scan of the basic overview of these civilizations. So again, the timeline goes from top to bottom, covering about 5,500 years. Then the middle columns are the most important, of course, where you have Egyptian civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, and then a line in the middle where it starts as, this melding of them. And then you have the Near Eastern phase of Central Civilization, in which also the Greek civilization becomes a part. That civilization then, goes to the Greco-Roman phase between about 500 BC and 500 AD. 500 AD, you have the Middle Ages, so that phase sets in, a little bit different, but it's still the same civilization. Then around 1500, 1600, with the Renaissance and modernity, we got the Western phase, and then, 1990, 2000, we got the global phase. And on the left and the right, on the left, you'll see many of the American civilizations that, of course, around 1500 get totally gobbled up in Western civilization. And on the right, the more Asian ones. And, the Indic, the Indonesian, Far Eastern, and Japanese. One of the most interesting parts here, and it might be a surprise, that the Indic civilization in this scheme stops at 1000 AD. Basically, when Islam invades the Indian subcontinent, the Indian civilization is, although it keeps a lot of its own practices and religion and, specific civilizational characteristics, but it gets incorporated into the medieval phase of Central Civilization. And in this picture, it's also then assumed that Islam itself is just a sub-variation already of this Central Civilization. It is already within this Central Civilization that it is developing. Anyway, this is a very fascinating research program, as I like to say it. I would bring in people like Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos to justify what has happened in this program. And it goes a little bit against, regular thinking. So the intricacies of this joining, and this goes back to the Egyptian and Mesopotamian, have been further addressed most recently with the idea that it happened in different phases by itself, with a pulsating rhythm. In the rendering of this process by world system sociologists Christopher Chase Dunn and Thomas Hall, first, and this is then a chronological rendering. First, you have both civilizations share down the line information flows. They know about each other, they might do some exchanges, but they're not really entangled too much. Then two, from 2050 BC on, they interacted with what they call in this research program, prestige goods network of trading luxury goods. So they're getting a little more entangled. Around 1500 BC, the crucial moment in Wilkinson's view, they become melded in a political military network, which doesn't rule out conflict. Europe as a civilization, it doesn't mean that they're not at each other's throats. Later, then their so-called bulk goods network comes together. And that's a very almost intimate integration of their economies. This is not a linear process, but has a pulsating rhythm between expansion and contraction. So quote from Chase Dunhall, not Wilkinson: all world systems pulsate in the sense that the spatial scale of integration, especially by trade, becomes larger and then smaller again. During the enlarging phase, trade networks grow in territorial size and become more dense in terms of the frequency of transactions. During the declining phase, trade slackens and local areas become less connected and reorganize around self-sufficiency. Local identities and the cultural distinctions between local groups and outsiders are emphasized. And we're getting back to this pulsating rhythm because we might be in for something of a, maybe a not so nice part of a rhythm. To this, I would add that the observed pulsating rhythm is still operative in the modern world with a 19th century phase of integration through European imperialism, then a relative dispersal after World War II through decolonization, which was followed then by a phase of globalization by way of international institutions and multinational corporations, only to be, and I would say slightly reversed by a resurgence of nationalism and resistance against globalization. All right, now we'll come to our friend Michael Hudson and the fight over debt. It will be interesting to see how Hudson's historical findings about economic systems and practices would dovetail with the findings of James and Wilkinson. One of the big transitions in that epoch, as addressed above, was the collapse of the Bronze Age cultures around 1200 BC and the rise of the Iron Age empires. About the difference between the two ages and how they are perceived, Hudson wrote, "The Bronze Age Near East was organized on principles so different from those of today that it seems unconnected to modern civilization. That is why most economists and social theorists prefer to pick up the historical thread with the more familiar Greece and Rome. The main point he hammers home with great emphasis is that in all civilizations, debts accumulate and a creditor class arises, which will try to consolidate and enlarge its gains." Quote, "The basic dynamic of debt is to accrue and intrude increasingly into the economy, absorbing the surplus and transferring land and even the personal liberty of debtors to creditors. This tendency will lead to impoverishment, polarization, and possible economic collapse. To prevent this possibility, the powers that be during the Bronze Age, that is, the kings and the priests in their palaces and temples, would declare occasional or by law an overall debt forgiveness or debt jubilee, which would restore some balance in society between debtors and creditors. Agrarian debts by farmers to the palace would be forgiven. Bond servants would be allowed to go home. And lands or crops pledged to creditors will be returned to the debtors." According to Hudson, quote, "The economic aim of debt jubilees was to restore solvency to the population as a whole. Many royal proclamations also freed businesses from various taxes and tariff duties. But the main objective was political and ideological. It was to create a fair and equitable society." Hudson argues that in classic Greece and Rome, the practice of debt jubilees was forgotten or abolished and replaced by an unforgiving, strict enforcement of debt obligations, which became the main tool of a predatory oligarchy to extend its wealth and power regardless of its long-term self-defeating consequences. Quote, "As credit became more widely privatized, usury became the major lever to pry away land and crop rights and to reduce labor to irreversible bondage. The process culminated with classical antiquities oligarchies replacing divine kingship with creditor-oriented rules, or rulers. I think it should be rulers. This type of predatory oligarchy using debt as power is still functional today, as it dominated and survived one way or another the ups and downs of Central civilization throughout its many phases. Now, some remarks about the integration of all this research. And here we go, too. The possible epiphanic insight I'm aiming at is that the egoic scheming capacity of the post-bicameral mind after the Bronze Age collapse was such that A, it became the prevalent mental architecture of the population of Central civilization, especially its power elite, and became this class hidden, efficient motor, enabling its dubious success in subduing almost all other classes and bicameral societies, acculturating its new members into the new conscious egoic mentality. And that B, a new kind of ruling elite arose, which power was based on sanctifying debt obligations without the escape of system-preserving write-offs, as was the wisdom during the Bronze Age in the form of debt jubilees. Furthermore, C, this rigidity became also the main factor in ongoing debt-based financial crises, including triggering system-wide collapses like the fall of the West Roman Empire, later the Great Depression, and recently the global financial crisis. With always the next one lurking around the corner with possible destructive impacts nobody can foresee. Other more specific questions in this regard will be about D, the origin of debt jubilee decisions in auditory command hallucinations experienced by kings and or priests. E, the idea that there could be a correlation between the size of a civilizational unit and the efficacy of implementing a debt jubilee. In other words, the relative proximity of the population to its rulers. That is, there might be a maximum size to bicameral socioeconomic units in which it makes sense or which are tight enough between the rulers and the population that there is some natural solidarity between the two. But if it becomes too big, new rules have to be almost invented. Also, another specific question, F, the idea that post-bicameral man learned to scheme more effectively within his inner mind space with the possibility that a predatory creditor class could arise, blocking the kings and priests for implementing a debt jubilee. So there has been, according to Hudson, a back and forth power struggle between the one side kings and priests that for several reasons were in favor of debt jubilees, and then of course the creditor class that's not in favor. Now, with all this talk about the bicameral mind and the difference between the present-day human mind, I'm going to introduce, to get a better sense of that, because I know for a lot of people it might not, stick. So I composed an introductory story in which a lot of different kinds of experiences are displayed. Well, I'll talk about it after the story itself. Okay, here we go. A man is driving in his car on a long stretch of highway. He's a skilled driver, so he doesn't have to pay much attention to his driving, which proceeds semi-automatic and unproblematic. In this calm state, he remembers he was offended the other day by his boss and gets upset about it while running the scene through his head and also imagining regretfully how he should have reacted or would react maybe confidently in the future if something similar would happen. All in all, his sense of self is bounced around by feelings of shame, regret, frustration, and anger. Then suddenly he hears a loud, deep voice booming through his head, admonishing him, "You should beat up your boss." The man is shocked and asks himself, "Who says so?" No answer comes, and the driver starts imagining executing the command, which gives him some measure of satisfaction and resolution. His mind then trails off into trivial aspects of his life, which habit he recognizes as such, with the effect that the light daydreaming stops. After a little while, a peaceful silence overcomes him, and he becomes intensely aware of just driving his car. The feel, the noise, the speed, and the ever-changing landscape are viscerally experienced. Ooh, then a dog crossed the road. The driver, without fear or second thoughts, swerves to the right and back to the left in a mode of expert performance, evading the dog and not crashing into the side of the road. Afterwards, he experiences the fear of what could have happened, but with some struggle dismisses the scenarios. When his point of arrival is looming, he begins to imagine his wife, his upcoming dinner, and the football game on TV of his favorite team. So this story and all these different experiences maybe you already recognized something of so-called the bicameral mind. He hears a voice of what to do. That's very much something about the bicameral mind. The expert's way of evading the dog has to do with the kind of mindfulness in action that you can have, let's say in high-performance sports or other high-performance activities, where you're really into the moment itself and you're highly skilled. And you don't have to analyze the situation. You don't have to run in your mind an analysis of possibilities. Then, of course, in the story itself, he has all these fantasies of possibilities. And that is, according to James, one of the specific characteristics of modern humanity. Anyway, I composed a little double column to compare bicameral mind and the modern mind to make it a little more clear. Categories in the first column, then the bicameral mind second, and then the human mind in the third. So about identity in the bicameral mind time, the sense of self is embedded in the collective. But our sense of mind is lodged in inner mind space. As far as reflection is concerned, bicameral mind is pre-reflective. We are pretty self-conscious. Belief and faith in the bicameral societies, social norms and divine commands are lived as absolute dogmatic truths. No what if or questioning. Our present mind, if we believe something, it's mostly we leap into it. It's open to skepticism and to philosophical reflection. About emotions, really interesting. Bicameral mind people had simple bodily dispersed emotions. It's in their gut, it's in their throat, it's in their heart, it's in their groin, it's in their, it's not necessarily centered within a mind. That is very much something for the present day human mind. And it is doubled in the mind. So back to the story, you can have a frightening situation, but if you run it again in your inner mind space, reliving it, you have doubled it. And that's something very specific about modern man. About cognition, bicameral mind is it's immediate experience is maybe not the best words, but it's very situational, it's very practical and adaptive. We are used to metacognition. We think about thinking. We, it's metacognition. It has to do also with self-consciousness. Then the voices, if we hear them, bicameral mind has gods and ancestors talking to him. We are used to some kind of inner dialogue. Very much in the Janesian research, there's this whole thing about the difference between the right imaginative holistic hemisphere of our brain and the left verbal concentrated on particulars left hemisphere. And bicameral mind is such that the hallucinations have their origin in the right hemisphere and are then received in the left hemisphere as if these come from outside. And they have done, research in that to see if that's going on in the mind. Anyway, to make it even more clear that this is a very serious research program. So one of the names you can call it is neurocultural history. And so the neurocultural history of other civilizations, as far as the switch between a bicameral mindset and a modern mindset is concerned, has been looked into. for ancient Egypt, of course, that's McVeigh and James doing that. For Mesopotamia, James himself. Biblical times, there's a rabbi seeing the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you know, the mindset difference between a Moses and a Jesus. Ancient Greece, there are a lot there. Looking into that, ancient Tibet, guy called Gibson, he's a Tibetologist. In Japan, McVeigh was a student of James, and he lived in Japan for quite a while. So he looked into Japan, and he looked also in China. And interestingly, for a long while, nobody really looked into India. So I met this research student, PhD candidate from the University of Delhi, Shruti Sharma, and she's doing her PhD philosophy thesis specifically on the bicameral mind and its difference to be identified within Indian civilization, within Indian history, where the idea is that the time of the Vedas, which is in the second millennium, it's very much more a bicameral mindset. And with the Upanishads, with a lot of philosophy about the mind, about the self, and about the overself, it's very much more of a modern mindset. So this is going on as far as research is concerned. So to give a little overview, we got this deep history of different adaptive mental architectures. We had a pre-bicameral mind before 12,000. We then had a bicameral mind that comes on. Then we have the present-day human mind with its present-day human self. And that one you can also cut into three categories. So in the beginning of the modern mind was still a nostalgic religious tendency to reactivate aspects of the bicameral mind. Meaning people were engaged in either taking drugs or getting into an ecstatic mindset or doing rituals or going to oracles or divinations to get these voices going again, to get instructions, to connect with the old gods or the old, you know, the ancestors. Another subsection that comes in later, and that's basically also then connected with so-called the actual age, our inner mind became more forward-looking, not backward-looking, more secular. Rational tendencies, you know, were developed. Philosophy, skepticism, etc., all to better plan. And then there are some balancing acts where there were some, let's say, ideologies or sects or little, you know, religions that try to balance between the two, between something rational and something religious. Then, and this is already a preview towards the future, we might have an emerging post-egoic mind that was already pioneered by Buddha and maybe also by Krishnamurti and a lot of people in between the two. So we got a lot of different and a history of different mindsets. So this is from Canadian Psychological Association, who took apparently James very serious. A guy called Stowe made this. So you got the pre-bicameral mind, where language evolved, tools, diverse voices came for him about 10,000 BCE. Then bicameral mind, with the first towns, 3000 BCE, writing begins, 1200 BCE, epic narratives. Then consciousness, or modern consciousness, the voices diminish, and in his research, he says, you know, by the year 0, around Jesus, the voices are gone. The gods are gone. There's only a remembrance of such experiences. And we're still in this so-called conscious state. Now, I took this screenshot and then this little thing in the middle, select table column, got stuck in. I'm sorry about that. But I'm used to make these columns and these differentiations. So here I am trying to align these mental architectures with economics and inequality. So again, we got In the left column, going from top to bottom, pre-bicameral, bicameral, ancient self, medieval self, and in the follow slide, I'll go into modern time. The economics, like pre-bicameral, you would have probably gift economies. Money-wise, no banking, but some simple currency. And you would already have problems in inequality, because in gift economies, there is a tendency that the chief accumulates a lot of goods, and sometimes too much. So the way to solve that or manage that is that, the chief can just redistribute what he got, but there are also indications that he will put all the surplus to a bonfire. And there is this Marcel Mauss, French anthropologist, who has looked into such kind of practices in gift economies. So in the bicameral age, you have a palatial or temple system. It is hierarchical, it is authoritarian. There is credit going on, but it comes from the palaces or the temples. And there is already the invention of interest-based debt and the rise of it. Now again, that creates problems. Creditors obtain land and indentured labor from the debtors. What's the solution then? Redistributive clean slate or jubilee. You start with a clean slate, and then it can build up again for 30 years, 50 years, 80 years, and you'll do it again. Then in Greece and Rome, where you have, already a sense of self, but it's an ancient sense of self. The economy is oligarchic, it's run by creditors, basically. You got traders, authorities that create credit. Of course, they inherit interest-based debt, and you got some gold and silver as a currency. And as far as problems concerned, the same problems. Creditors obtain land and indentured labor from debtors. Now, there is no solution in ancient Greece and Rome, because what is the way of managing is a sanctification of debt and contracts. So it exacerbates the situation. Then we go into the medieval self, aristocratic, theocratic. Still, you got credits, you got rise of banks, and you still got gold and silver in currency. And still the same problem. Creditors obtain land and indentured labor from debtors. But now there's a little bit of a way of managing that or preventing that with a ban of usury. But I don't think that was really very effective. In Islam and in Christianity, there was this ban on usury, but I still have to look further into, how effective that was to manage the trend towards inequality. Then I got a modern self 1, 2, and 3, and here I follow the 3 big, modern choices that we have in political economics. Modern self 1 of the free market, modern self 2 of a mixed economy, modern self 3, socialism. Banking and money, there is almost the same. Credit creation by private banks, but maybe in a mixed economy, you'll have also public banks. Of course, in socialism, you will have credit creation by nationalized banks, and usually also some credit guidance. I could have added also, let's say the modern self 4 in fascism, and credit guidance in Japan and Germany was very applied in the fascist political economy. Still problems with inequality in the free market, of course. Creditors accumulate huge amounts of capital, land, and cheap labor. What's the solution? None. Minimal taxation, philanthropy, but there is no solution to the inequality. In a mixed economy, same problem, but now you have redistributive taxation, and you got the state providing health, education, pensions, etc. It's kind of a reformist way of dealing with the problem. In a socialist country, we'll have, some pigs are more equal than other pigs. So functionaries accumulate privileges, which will create resentment with the workers. But still, as a solution or management of these inequalities, you have redistributive taxation. And again, the state provides health, education, and pensions. But it's in, with socialism, it's more in a revolutionary mode. Now, again, this is a step towards the future where I'm talking about so-called post-egoic age, which might be or will be, of course, democratic, egalitarian, utopian. Maybe there's still credit creation, but then by the state. If there are banks, public banks, private banks, they will have to intermediate. Inequality might only be on a small scale and unintended. There's not a predator class anymore that really, really organizes itself to get the goods and let the rest of humanity just suffer. So how do they manage that? Well, one of our big things is redistributive money creation. That can prevent a lot of inequality. Again, redistributive taxation, universal basic income, public banks, etc., all transformative and preventative. But this is in the future, we might not have any idea how that might go. So there are 6 items then about the future that I like to address here. One, the current geopolitical structure and dynamics, which is premised on a mix of research of these power elite studies that I talked about, world system theory, and comparative civilizational studies, and with a leading role for the concept of central civilization. 2, specific analysis of the trajectories of China and India. 3, perspectives to keep in mind from knowledgeable researchers, some quotes I have there. 4, incorporating the logic of systemic breakdown and ensuing dark ages. 5, learning from Buddhist ethics and economics as possible way showers into the future. And 6, speculation about the correlation between doctrines of mind and conceptions of money. Now we got a little bit of a map. You will recognize these are the 2 blocks that are facing each other, the blue against the red. The dark blue is NATO. The light blue are allies of NATO. The very important allies are, of course, then Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And then, if you can see that, Norway and Finland are light blue, but because of the war in the Ukraine, they have become members of NATO. So they are now dark blue. This is the usual way that people see, a world map, but I'm always more interested because this will be the future where we'll have China in the middle. So basically, this is the same. But here it's also indicating, and the ledger on the left will indicate what kind of groups different countries belong to. It's again red against blue, but one of the most interesting and geographically interestingly placed countries is India. Is it going with the West? Is it going with China and Russia? What is its game? Where is it going to? I'll address that in a minute, but first the trajectory of China. Really, really interesting because, and this is looking into the future, China can be seen as a transformation of a major communist power from an antagonist, in the Cold War, to resistor in 70s, 80s, to participant in the 90s, to reformer from now on, to even protector, and finally to leader of the international capitalist system. And this whole development is quite extraordinary. And that's what I'm making here as a case. This would be a quite extraordinary arc of political emergence, though some would say it's a natural foreordained re-emergence. And that's especially coming from not only André Gunder Frank, but from many others. China has always been one of the big economic powerhouses for the last, 3,000 to 4,000 years, and it will become again such. The trajectory of India, oh my God, this is so interesting. India seems to be intentionally situating itself between the trilateral West, and with that I mean the US, Europe, and Japan. B, the global South, so that's, almost, South Asia, Africa, and South America. And also then the Russia-China combo. And a lot of people think that Russia and China are sometimes connected, but I think since 1949, they have a strategic understanding, but sometimes they are tactically, at odds with each other. But they are a combo, very serious combo. So India is part of the following interesting mix of groups: BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And this is the gathering of the global semi-periphery. So before I had a part of this presentation of a explanation of world system theory, where you have the core, which are the rich countries, you have the periphery, which are all the poor countries, but in the middle, there are these semi-periphery countries that are exploited by the West, but are themselves exploiting the even more poor countries. And it's specifically there, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and some other countries that are part of the semi-periphery. So BRICS can be seen as the rise of the semi-periphery, collecting itself and making a fist against the core. Then there's SCO, that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's the gathering of East and South Asia and includes Pakistan, which is interesting from an Indian perspective because Pakistan is hosting the next big meeting, and India, with its problems with Pakistan, is now like, who shall we send? Modi, the prime minister, is not going, maybe not even the minister of foreign affairs, so there will be some high bureaucrat. But there is problems, of course, between Pakistan and India. Then we got the G20, which is the gathering of the trilateral core and the semi-periphery. So this group can be seen as well here, the trilateral core and the semi-periphery, BRICS and the West are just figuring out their differences, maybe coming to some understanding, to some consensus, to some projects, I don't know. But that can be seen as being done by the G20. And it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which is the think tank of the G20. They do most of the research that then gets into the G20. Then there is the Quad, and here we're getting into India getting more aligned with the West. Quadrilateral dialogue, gathering of the Pacific West, USA, Japan, Australia, with South Asia, India. Then they just joined this Mineral Security Partnership, MSP, and the Mineral Security Finance Network, MSFN. This is the trilateral core with India as only developing country. And this is based on the concern that Russia and China have most access to minerals, especially rare minerals. And for geopolitical reasons, that's not good. So we have to develop in the West, together with India, our own mining corporations to become less dependent on China and Russia. Anyway, in the context with India and China, the big question is, how will the relationship with China develop? For now, it's ambiguous with both cooperation and conflict. And there are a lot of items to be talked about that, but I'll skip that. Now I'll come to some perspectives to keep in mind. Tim DiMuggia, who we all know, quote, "It's perhaps more appropriate to conceptualize the history of the global political economy as divided into three eras: the pre-fossil fuel age, the age of fossil fuels, and the post-carbon age." So he takes an even longer and bigger perspective than I am doing, but it's something to keep in mind. Stephen Gill, this is, sorry about here, this is not totally well organized, but we're in a state of polycrisis or a global organic crisis in different spheres, in the sphere of political economy, in the sphere of ethics, in the sphere of law, society, culture, and ecology. You name it, all is in crisis. And the current neoliberal leadership of most powerful states and corporations is not competent to deal with these crises. Their focus is too much on financial and economic aspects and not social nor ecological aspects. The focus is, quote unquote, to sustain and enlarge capitalist market society. Another quote from him: disciplinary neoliberalism fosters and consolidates a possessively individualist, marketized common sense that militates against solidarity and social justice. He has also some things to say about the rise of the semi-periphery, because their development model is wasteful, energy-intensive, consumerist, ecologically myopic, and premised on catering mainly to the affluent. And I can give analyses of that happening here in India and might also in Bangladesh. Michael Hudson, keep in mind what he is saying. The ebb and flow that has characterized all subsequent economies and is still shaping today's world, which is the conflict between social constraints on predatory finance and the attempt by a rentier class to gain control. So it's the debtors against the creditors, ongoing conflict. Then in all epochs, a basic maxim applies: debts that can't be paid won't be paid. What always is at issue is just how they won't be paid. If they are not written down, they will become a lever for creditors to pry away property and income from debtors, in practice from the economy and community at large. Then I just heard 2 weeks ago Jeffrey Sachs in a meeting, very kind of dark, depressing meeting. Steve King was there too, Vanda Shiva, some other interesting people. The subject is, what can we do? You know, it's only getting worse. What can we do? And here the most important thing is, I think, is he saying, quote, we have a mindset problem. We have no lack of solutions that would improve human well-being, make our lives safer and more satisfying. I don't think we're not running out of answers. We're just not applying any, and that to my mind is both the puzzle, the challenge of where we are. And I would recommend people to do this thing organized by Global Political Economy, which runs about 2 hours and is very insightful. Okay, so in all these transitions between these mental architectures, I found that there are many times there is a dark age in between. And these dark ages, either A, trigger changes in mentality, or B, were caused by deficient mentalities. So the late Bronze Age collapse that I talked about, where we went from Bronze Age to Iron Age, there was a dark age after that, from 1100 to 700 BCE. And it was characterized by decline of long-distance trade. My internet might now be a bit unstable.
Still looks good on our end.
Okay, then I'll just, we're almost at the end, guys. So decline of long-distance trade, decline of diplomacy, writing and record-keeping down, urbanization and population down, but also the rise of private merchants and profit-oriented mercantile city-states, which is an interesting change also of economics. And this is then also the change from the bicameral to the modern mind. Then from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and Hudson has a whole book about that, the collapse of antiquity, collapse of the West Roman Empire, and then a dark age of 600 years, from 500 to 1100. 1100, you know, the rise of the High Middle Ages, which was kind of a mini Renaissance. Same thing there, decline of long-distance trade, urbanization, use of coinage, population goes down, slavery goes down, luckily. But serfdom comes up. So rise of self-sufficient, isolated economies, decentralized feudalism, serfdom, barter, and monastic communities. So what about the future? From late capitalism to what I would call post-egoic arrangements. There will be a collapse of globalism. And I think there will be a dark age, and this date is totally speculative, from 2100 to 2300. I might be optimistic that it will only be 200 years. I might be, you know, it might start earlier. Nobody knows. But the characteristics will be decline of long-distance trade, decline of global production and supply chains of semi-finished goods, decline of diplomacy, urbanization, population, etc., and the power and size of transnational corporations. They might even not survive, like dinosaurs didn't survive, and decline of democracy. What could be expected then again is a rise of self-sufficient isolated economies, decentralized politics, still also ethnocentric and nationalist groupings led by local warlords, etc. You can just fill it in with what we know about the past. But what can we expect after a hopefully short dark age? Okay, depends on the following factors that I'll address. Learning from the causes of the collapse, which were financialized corporate capitalism, B, failure of democratic oversight, C, egoic individualistic mindsets. Another factor that might be nice would be the acceptance of and experimentation with a post-egoic mindset which is intelligent and sensitive to social and ecological issues. 3, studying post-egoic teachers of mankind from the early Buddha, 600 BC, till 20th century Guido Krishnamurti and many in between. Also studying Buddhist political economics from Buddha to Bhutan, including writings like Small is Beautiful by Schumacher. So some observations of Buddhist economics then. Attention to Buddhist economics with a focus on the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, 3rd century BCE, to the Maurya Empire, which was functional between 322 to 185 BCE. This focus is premised on the idea that ancient Indian Buddhism as a political economic movement was maybe the first one to apply an ethic based on a post-egoic mindset, both as practiced and as an ideology. But we can also learn from modern Buddhist countries and their struggles with neoliberal individualism. Ashoka's Buddhist economic principles differed from Hindu economic systems in several key ways, most notably in its emphasis on state-sponsored welfare, non-violence in economic activities, and ethical redistribution of wealth. Infrastructure projects were promoted like building of hospitals, schools, monasteries, roads, waterways, wells, and planting of trees. In contrast, pre- and post-Buddhist Hindu economics focused more on accumulation of wealth within the caste hierarchies of the Varna system, also for temple patronage and ritual obligations. While both systems acknowledge the moral principle of righteousness, dharma, as central to economic life, Ashoka's Buddhist dharma was far more oriented toward public welfare and ethical production than the largely ritual and caste-based Hindu system that came before and after Buddhism's peak. In modern Buddhist majority countries, the influence of Buddhist economics can be seen in policies promoting moderation, ethical behavior, environmental sustainability, and social welfare, not warfare, welfare. Countries like Bhutan have institutionalized these principles in their development models like gross national happiness, and Thailand promotes its sufficiency economy model. However, these ideals coexist with the problems of modern financialized capitalism, such as inequality, consumerism, and global economic pressures, which obstruct the full realization of Buddhist economic principles. So some more characteristics of this post-egoic community of citizens. I already put it there under the know more about how to deal with inequality. So it will be democratic, egalitarian, utopian, probably, or hopefully credit creation by the state and local authorities, intermediation by private and public banks. Corporations, I guess, will be non-profit and serve social ends. Again, there will be small-scale unintended inequalities, but we'll have this redistributive money creation, redistributive taxation, UBI, PPS, etc., etc. Now, this is the last one that I'm still working on. One of these tables. First column is the mindset, again, going from top to bottom historically, pre-bicameral, bicameral, conscious, post-egoic. The ontology of mind that is prevalent. So pre-bicameral, I don't know. But in bicameral, the mind or the self or the sense of self, the soul is subservient to the community. In conscious, more religious conceptions, the soul is created by God. in post-egoic, we see that the self is a human ideational construct. And then I'm saying there might be some correlation, congruence between the ontologies of mind, the concepts of mind in these different mindsets, and the ontology of money. So in the bicameral mindset, it might be seen that money was instituted by the gods. So that's it's sacred. In the conscious way, we have this idea, well, it's a commodity-based but essential entity. It has an essence, it exists, and you cannot just, make it disappear. But, and a lot of people are already knowing this, in a more post-egoic mindset, we totally know that money is just a legal construct constructed by humans. Of course, there were people that knew this already, like good old Aristotle. So this is a little, let's say, research that I'm still working on. This is about like how our sense of self has to do also with our sense of the beyond, the sense of sacredness, and whether or not there is a God, whether or not there is a soul. And then it has to do then also with an impact on our concepts and practices in the economic sphere. And therefore also our concept of money. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll stop the share here. Oh my, a lot of people added there. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, let's get some water and some breath. And I'm glad Bruce Wall is here. I'm also glad that Richard Robbins is here, because there's a lot that I know that they will pick up on. Also Stephen and others. But back to Lucille.
Okay, I'm just looking at the list, and Bruce Wall was first with his hand up. So I'd just say, Govert, that was amazing. I did not know I had no idea you were going to go where you went when you started in the beginning. It's like, oh my God, what's he doing? And it was so interesting. So much is there. So thank you for your work and your contributions and being among us. And I'll pass now to Bruce Wall. Go ahead, Bruce.
All right. Hello, Bruce.
Hello. I have lots of comments, but I won't. I will only ask one very specific question. I agree 100% with Lucille. I had no idea where you were coming from, except that the scale was huge. My specific question is, if you put Slatsky's comment, is that right? In the chat, you said, just at the end, he had said something like, what can we do? And he came up with the mindset as the problem.
Yeah. That was
Jeffrey Sachs.
Yeah, Jeffrey Slatsky, right?
No. Jeff
Okay.
Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. Yeah.
All right.
Jeffrey Sachs.
You have the that reference somewhere.
Yes. And I can, later after the session with Robbins, if people want some.
I want that before later this afternoon.
Yeah.
No, I don't need it that far. But yeah, that was terrific. That's all I'll say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I just put, I think, the reference in the chat. Maybe you can look it up. So
okay, thanks.
That was
Yeah.
And okay, Eric, you're on if you want to speak or put your video on, but please make it concise. A question.
Howdy, sir. It's very interesting intergenerational and civilizational talks of these contributors. I have two questions. First, what do you think of the so-called mental architectures or the mindset since then of the past Bronze Ages or Middle Ages or even Dark Ages of the bankers? the financiers or of those lenders and the economists and the politicians since then until now? Are this because of any genes or DNA of greed, insofar as there is a way of clean slate transition, or we're gonna be on the way of dark digital or technology? So, okay, there is another question. Of forgiveness and debt cancellation in the developing world, we need it. So, what is the dissimilarity of this bullshit hullabaloo between debt forgiveness and debt cancellation or debt jubilee, insofar as it is related directly to extractive debt finance money creation of ex nihilo from the Western world? And, and on the other hand, I am very concerned about the global debt of 315 trillion of the present civilization, and the government projection to G7, G20 probably is going to get worse from 500 trillion to $1 quadrillion in the next 10 to 20 years. And that's going to be the collapse of the civilization. But whether it is an affront to rich nation or bilateral nations, or economic embargo to the poor nation like Philippines, or cessation of foreign aids, or a threats of war, cancellation of debt,
Okay, thank you, Eric.
the
I think we
very,
got
very
the two
important
questions.
population.
And let's let
And
Govert
thank you.
answer the two questions, and then we'll move
Okay.
Thank you.
to Elizabeth. Thank
Yeah,
you.
All right.
thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric. I'm in contact with Eric, and I know a little bit more than about, what's happening in the Philippines. So let's go for what's going on now. Yes, there's debt accumulation, but it's used as a trap to extract resources. So there's a whole analysis of the IMF that it was a debt trap. And if countries, knocked on their door because they had problems with their exchange rates, there were conditions imposed. And that kept growing after World War II till basically the IMF has become the Ministry of Economic Affairs on a global scale. But their decisions are not equitable. And they're run by behind the scenes, I think, and set up by Western bankers to get a extractive system going. And as far as these bankers are concerned, throughout history, at one side, they are just part of a power elite that just instructs their own children to reproduce that system. And for many of them, it might be just normal to be in that class. This is how things work, and they might have justifications, rationalizations to keep it working, and some of them might even think that it's a good system. So, it's really about the mindset that has to change. And I don't know. Yeah, the Philippines are like in the periphery. They're being exploited. And as Jeffrey Sachs said, there are solutions, but we're not applying them. Look at our little group. We have a lot of solutions, but they're not being applied. And that's the tragedy. And that's the tragedy with, last thing, yes, debts will accumulate. Hudson says at a certain moment they will not be paid. And then the whole trick is, how will they not be paid? Will they be written off, or will they become tools of power, debt as power, to even get more extractions? I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I have one question with the future. You didn't figure in the BRICS. On their policies, you can run your country any which way you want to, that's your problem. But we want to have international trade, and through trade, we facilitate trade. And with trade, we get everybody up to sort of an equal standard of living, that would avoid wars, etc. And you didn't figure that in at all. How do you feel about that?
Are you saying that BRICS that's one of its aims?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I think that's just propaganda, and they're out for themselves. So
Very, very negative.
yes, I'm sorry about that.
But it makes a lot of sense. I mean, everybody gains. I mean, this is a very
Oh, I'm totally in favor of the policy. I'm totally in favor of a lot of policies and a lot of ways that people are promoting solutions. But as you know, BRICS is not even well organized because the two biggest countries there they are in conflict basically. China and India. In a lot of ways, they don't like each other. They're in last years there were soldiers, they shot at each other. We had a lot of people dying. And to come back, I'm keeping BRICS in the picture, especially with my analysis of India, because India has not really made, a very big decision like, are we with the West, are we with China and Russia, and maybe they can do good, be something of a mediator in between. But they have their own agenda also, very much so. They want to develop, they want, minerals, they want resources, they want their people to become wealthy. They are gung-ho to become the biggest economy, somewhere in the future. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
So, Stephen, you had your hand up, you put it down. I spotlighted you because we're also at time end. So there are 3 people on the stack. We could, since Covert's introducing Richard, we could just move straight through, but I'll give you that decision as well as a question if you want now.
Yeah,
But
I have access to Hobart at more times, so I won't go into it, but maybe later when we end the session, I'm gonna relate some stories, and I'll just say it so Hobart knows what I'll be up to. And it's the stories of Prometheus versus Job. The Greek Prometheus and Job, I think, is a bicameral modern mind switch there. I'd like to cover Solon the Wise a little bit. I'd like to cover money on St. Lawrence Island among the people I lived. And there's a fellow named William Cook who talked about, what comes up, what goes, comes down. But he talks about a transition of how a civilization can go to a new place, a further upness. So I want to create that. My quick question for now, but we can skip it, but it'll come up later, but it's just to share with Hobart. Since we are able to absorb your thinking and what's going on, can we start creating experiments consciously among all humans? Could AMI or could monetary reform or IMMR in particular create some experiment and be the change we want to see? Period. I'll leave it with that.
I leave it to people's private inclinations to experiment with, alternate consciousness or going towards transcendence, self-knowledge. How are we built up? What is the self? But yeah, I would refer to this so-called post-egoic tradition that's pretty old actually. And it might have preceded also Buddha himself. He comes out of a skeptical, almost atheist tradition himself. And so it's more like for everybody themselves to find something, because I don't want to, I could have jammed this presentation with references to Krishnamurti, but it's like, okay, that's my PhD field. I'll try to keep them out a little bit. But we have to find something.
Yeah, let's go on to Philip and Nick real quick.
Okay.
at least Philip, if we have time. Go ahead, Philip.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you for an extremely engaging presentation. And personally, it touched and wove together a number of topics that I have long been interested in. But I want to refer you to something that I think is going to be very helpful in a particular earlier phase of your research, having to do with a controversial thread in anthropology initiated by Maria Gombudas and her work on goddess based cultures in old Europe. But that has been amplified recently by some new work precipitated by David Reich, who writes a book that is subtitled Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past. He's speaking about paleogenomics, which is a method for analyzing the genetic structure of ancient bones. And what they have been able to do is document a migratory transition out of the Eurasian Russian steppes into Europe, which brought about a fundamental transformation of culture and I think most specifically procreative behaviors, resulting in a total domination of prior patterns of procreation by these new migrants. So this whole area.
Yeah, I will be interested in that because this will be part of the pre-bicameral mind, and I still want to know more about what happened then, just to fill out indeed all these possibilities. So if you want to share that, please do. Please do.
Again, thank you very much. Interesting, very interesting.
Thank you, Philip. So Nick, you unmute. You're the last one before.
Okay, Nick.
I'm
unmuted.
Hobart, that was such a great talk, and I really appreciate it. And I'm gonna do my research on that bicameral mind with you in mind. And I want to kind of just bring in the thought of what we had from the Macmillan presentation, the Matai presentation, the Maher and Aquano presentation yesterday, and then you going way back, and where we go in the future. And I think that we can't just focus, and we're going future now. We just can't focus on what kind of economic system we have, or what kind of political system we have, or what kind of monetary system we have, but all of those together, because they're all interrelate. So, I mean, basically, the way I look at it is we have a political system we're trying to hold on to in this country, which is democracy, but it's a democracy light. It needs plenty of work. And then, as Macmillan brought out, we have a capitalist system, but it's a corporate capitalist system based on the corporates. And then we have our bank-created debt money system. So my question to you in 30 seconds to tell us how all your great research is going to move us forward in this regard.
Studying. And if you go to Stephen, that's where my library is, where I have almost all the books that and sources that I use. But those are in Chicago. I'm in India. And there's a 5-page bibliography attached to this presentation. I don't have a silver bullet for that. It's more like whatever, as you say, I'm now interested in the bicameral mind. So, start Googling that, start getting maybe ChatGPT, whatever, educate yourself with whatever point that makes sense to you. If it's goddesses, then that's the entry point. If it's this, that. If it's Buddhist economics, which I'm very interested in, and Buddhist ethics, then that's your entry point. Otherwise, I'm too late to the game of really becoming a teacher. I can do presentations like this, but
Thank you, Hobart.
But we'll stay in contact. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. We have to pivot.